Recognized Uncle Walker D01. Recognized Magpie Games D17. Initiate Masks actual play pre-discussion.
Welcome everyone to our first Young Justice inspired role-playing game actual play special. Today I'm honored to welcome Brendan Conway, the creator of Masks: A New Generation, the role-playing game, aka RPG, we'll be playing today. Brendan was also kind enough to run this game for us as well. Could not be more honored about that. In this introductory interview, we're going to talk to Brendan about what makes Masks different from other RPGs and a little about how the game works at the table. Hopefully this will give you a foundation for the actual play you're about to listen to, even though it's very heavily dramatic, you'll see, and though the mechanics are involved, the story is the focus. But that isn't all. After the game, we will be posting a special discussion session with Brendan talking about the game, how he ran it, how he set it up, his love for Young Justice, and all the regular stuff we talk about in our discussion episodes. Brendan, thanks so much for coming on the show and for running this a fantastic game.
Thanks so much for having me and for setting it all up.
Oh man, it was amazing. It's one of the best games I've been in a very long time. So I'm really excited for people to hear it. So let's start with the basics. We're going to talk a little bit about you specifically in the post interview in the discussion session. So let's just dive in a little bit. So you work with or for Magpie Games, is that correct?
Yep, I am one of the co-owners of Magpie Games, along with Marissa Kelly, Mark Diaz-Truman, Sarah Richardson. We are the Magpie Nest, as I say, with shame in my heart.
Nice.
And yeah, we have been in this gig to some extent or another for several years now. We've done a whole bunch of different games, and Masks is the first full game that I have written and led.
Nice. So let's talk about that a little bit. Now, I can assume, let's talk about Masks in a broad sense. What is Masks? What does it do? What is your intention for it as a game? Before we get into the mechanics and that kind of thing.
Totally. My initial premise with Masks and my initial purpose was I wanted a game that let me do Young Justice and really do Young Justice, and that would replicate This was
a question I was going to ask you, because I clearly it's an influence, but I mean, in the book itself, you talk about with this particular playbook, it's inspired by, McGann, but you name a bunch of other characters too, like the Janice character, who we'll talk about that playbook in a minute, is basically Spider-Man inspired, right? Mm-hmm. Somebody walking that thin line between, am I the person or the mask, and, dealing with school and dealing with those things, which could also be reflected in a few different characters, but maybe Artemis or that kind of thing. So I was wondering how much Young Justice influenced this game, because we talk about your game a lot on this show and refer to it as the unofficial Young Justice role-playing game, basically. So,
yeah, I like that title. Young Justice was instrumental in the sense that it was one of the earliest, essentially, texts that I was examining, partaking of, enjoying the heck out of in order to create Masks. But on the whole, it did require me / benefit from partaking of everything I could get in that genre. So, of course, I went back to the original Teen Titans issues and the Teen Titans cartoon show itself, and Young Avengers, specifically the run by Kieran Gillen and James McKelvey, was one of the huge influences upon Masks. And a big part of creating Masks was picking out the specific repeating themes and elements, motifs, characteristics of all of these different works, and setting up a system that could repeat or reflect those crucial pieces, so that, to some extent, all of these different stories were within the sphere of what Masks could do.
Right. Now, that's great, and people, when I describe role-playing games like, say, Champions or Dungeons & Dragons, it's like, yeah, we want to tell some stories and we want to sit around a table. But I think what people who aren't involved in role-playing games don't grasp until you get into it a little deeper is how the mechanics feed that feel that you want. So Dungeons & Dragons is there's an exploration tier and a social tier and a combat tier now, anyway. But at its heart, all the classes are based on combat mechanics, a little bit of social stuff here and there. Or Champions, which is all about how are your superpowers created, right? It's all about what is your superpowers, and then the role-playing stuff you kind of layer on yourself. There's no mechanics that feed into it outside of, say, skills. But Masks and, in general, Powered by the Apocalypse games are very different. Can you talk briefly about what is a Powered by the Apocalypse game, and then how is Masks different than these other games?
Absolutely. So Powered by the Apocalypse is a term that comes from Apocalypse World, the first game in this entire now large family tree. And that is a game by D. Vincent Baker and Megway Baker, now with a second edition that just came out relatively recently. That was a post-apocalyptic game, very Mad Max-ish, and it set up all of the basic structures and rules that everything would generally follow. The core pieces of it are moves, which are specifically phrased as when you do X, then Y. Very sort of programmatic. When you seize something by force, then roll plus hard. And every time it says roll, you would roll 2 6-sided dice. And all these moves break it down in the same way. They say 10 plus is a full hit, and that means things are generally going to go the way you wanted. 7 to 9 is a partial hit, which means you're going to get basically what you wanted, but some cost or caveat or complication is going to be attached. And then a 6 or less is called a miss, which means the GM gets to say what happens, and it can be pretty bad, or it can be any of a number of wide variety of things. It's not a failure, because sometimes the best misses are you get exactly what you wanted and it's horrible.
Right. That was one thing I was going to bring up. Like, that's something about it. The fact that it hands it over to the person running the game doesn't necessarily mean you don't get what you want. It's like, okay, well, you hit the villain and you knock him unconscious, but you also knock him off of a building into a crowd of people, and now the crowd of people are hurt. So it becomes more of a dramatic, at least it gives the person running the game some dramatic hooks that they can add, you know, instead of it being binary like a D&D game where it's like, okay, well, you either hit or you miss. You get variations.
Exactly. And within the context of Masks in particular, it's crucial that when I'm running the game, I am into your characters, and I love your characters, and I think they're super cool heroes, and I'm a fan of this comic that we're functionally creating together. And so as a fan, I don't really want to see Robin, like, miss punches, unless Robin's up against someone where that's cool, because he's fighting Ra's al Ghul, and yeah, okay, cool. Robin missing a punch against Ra's al Ghul, well, that checks out. But Robin missing a punch against some chump, that's not cool, right. That's not interesting. So instead, I'm going to do something else. I'm going to do some other complication thing that is cool, that keeps Robin cool while keeping the drama high.
Yeah, exactly. So I love it. And there's another aspect of Powered by the Apocalypse games in general, I believe, and you can correct me, I've only played a couple, but the idea that the moves follow the narrative, not the narrative following the rules. And what I mean by that is in Dungeons & Dragons, it's basically a reactive game. Here's a troll. What do you want to do? Oh, okay, well, I'm going to swing at it with my sword. Okay, great. Roll to see if you hit. And then when you do the thing, then you talk about, okay, so you missed, so what does that look like? Right? So that's the narrative following the move, kind of. Mm-hmm. So for you, your focus of this game is tell me the story of what's happening, and when we happen to come across something that looks like a move, then we'll use that. Right? So we're telling you, like, oh, okay, Robin wants to do X. Like, Robin wants to punch Ra's al Ghul. Okay, well, now the move follows the narrative because that makes sense. But it becomes much more subtle when you're talking about social interactions and you're talking about inter-team interactions.
Right. It has the advantage of potentially working both ways depending upon your players. If you have players who say, well, I know I want to do this thing because I like the way this move looks and my stats are telling me I'm good at this, so how can I do it? You then have to do something in the fiction that actually hits that move. So to directly engage a threat, you might like that move and all of its mechanical results, but then in the fiction you have to directly engage a threat, come at Killer Croc swinging. And the vice versa version of it is you might say something really nice to make Megan feel better and calm her down. And that turns out to then trigger the mechanical side of it, the comfort or support move. And then we roll the move to see what happens next. The core here that we get is this nice thing where these moves resolve uncertainty. And it works on both sides, where simultaneously, I don't know for sure what happens when Robin comes at Killer Croc. I could see Robin just beating Killer Croc, but I could also see Killer Croc smashing Robin into the wall with his tail. So the move helps resolve that side of it, while also telling us that when you try to comfort McGann, there's this moment of tension, and the game is telling us we don't actually know what happens next. It might go well. It might be perfect. It might be exactly what she needed to hear. And it also might be interpreted exactly the wrong way, and it turns out that, oh no, what you just said was not the right thing and has made things worse.
Right, which is very reflective of human interaction, right?
Yep.
But I think that leads us into something else to talk about. Like we've mentioned some combat-oriented things and then a couple of social things. But this game really balances the action of a comic with the dramatic interpersonal tension of a show like Young Justice. And one of the ways that it does that is that there is not like, say, if people who've listened to our show who are familiar with video games, it's not like you don't have a stack of something called hit points. Like you don't have any hit points at all. There is no mechanic for that. So the focus of the game are on two, what I think are very interesting ideas, which is one, the ability scores of your characters are not strength and dexterity and intelligence and presence and whatever these things are, right? And they're your ability scores, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, your ability scores are basically how do you perceive yourself. So it's freak and superior and mundane. And so these are more psychological concepts about who you are and what you do. Is that correct? Is that kind of what you were aiming for?
Yep, that's exactly it. That's how I explain it. The higher your given label is, the higher your danger is, the more you see yourself as that thing. So if you've got your danger +3, you see yourself as this dangerous person, a threat to everyone around you. And all of them are supposed to have this double-edged thing where, having a high freak means you probably do see yourself as weird and strange and not fitting in. And also, you see yourself as amazing, capable of doing things no one else can do. You're unique, you stand out from the crowd because of your incredible capabilities. And so all of them have this double-edged statement about how you see yourself that then also translates into what you're actually good at or more effective at within the game's mechanics. Right.
And then the other thing, there's no hit points, like I mentioned. There are conditions. And these aren't conditions like poisoned, or paralyzed. These are conditions that are psychological conditions. Like, the way I think of it is like, okay, the Hulk just punched me in the face. All right. So you roll a move, like I'm the GM and I say the Hulk just punched you in the face, right? Or he's trying to punch you in the face. And you roll a move called take a powerful blow. And if you roll really well with that, unfortunately, like if you roll high, it's the only one where if you roll high, it's bad. If you roll really high, then you take conditions. But instead of saying something like, oh, your arm's broken or that kind of thing, that can be part of the narrative. But I ask you, so how do you feel about that? How do you feel about the Hulk just punching you in the face? And you can say, oh, I'm angry about it. Or I'm, insecure about my powers now. Or those kinds of things. Like I'm afraid. I'm scared of what's happening next. And that becomes a narrative thing. And of course, you can talk about having a broken arm or whatever it happens to be. But when you're talking about making reference back to the moves you were just talking about, like saying, why would I want to make a move of comforting McGann? The reason is because you want to remove these conditions from her, right? You want to help her get these conditions because they do penalize you mechanically, but the more conditions you have, we didn't really get to this point in our game, but like the more conditions you have, the more potentially hurt you are in some way, right? Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah. So, I mean, the core part of conditions that actually came in was I'm a little bit of a biased designer, and perhaps my favorite character is Hawkeye, and it's crucially important to me that you be able to play Hawkeye. And so when we're getting into all of this, it started from this realization of like, okay, hold on a second. It really doesn't make sense to have simultaneously Hawkeye and like Iron Man and have them somehow be anywhere equivalent if we're talking about hit points or some representation of their physical well-being.
Yes.
That would just blow up. And so I didn't want that, especially because that's not actually how the fiction works. After partaking all of this stuff and reading all of it and watching all of it, there's that thing where, like, actually the big strong guy who theoretically could punch through Robin doesn't punch Robin. He does other things at Robin. It never gets to the point where we think Robin's been punched so hard a fist will go through him. All of which fits together as, okay, so what matters here is that how these people feel and their emotions that come forward and how that changes how they act following their the hits. And that became the core focus of how we represent fights and how we represent the harm and the damage and the consequences moving forward from the fights, especially insofar as there's a mechanic for how you get rid of them. Without any help from anybody else, the way you get rid of conditions is always tied to doing something that's a little not so good. So like if you're angry, you've got to hurt someone or break something important. And if you're afraid, you've got to run away from something difficult. And so devoid of help from anybody else or any special moves or powers that get rid of your conditions, all of these conditions will always lead to you doing something else that is interesting.
Yeah, I love it. And then that feeds right into the idea behind how you create characters. So that the people listening understand that, okay, so my ability scores are freak and mundane, and how do I look at myself? And the consequences of conflict, whether that's physical conflict or social conflict, right? Because take a powerful blow could be someone that you respect insults you in public. It could be that, or the Hulk punching you in the face. Like it's applicable to any of these situations, right?
Yep.
But now let's talk about the characters, right? Because you don't have classes like in D&D. There's a druid and a fighter, right? And in some other classes, you might have, or some other superhero games, you might have something like, oh, I'm a blaster, right? Or I'm a brick,
right?
I have strong. I can take a lot of damage and punch things, so I'm a brick class. In yours, in Powered by the Apocalypse games, they don't have classes. They have things called playbooks, and in your playbooks, Robin isn't a gadgeteer martial artist character, and Kid Flash isn't a speedster character. Kid Flash uses the playbook, or he can use probably a few different playbooks, but the one that I think applies to him really good is the legacy character, which is I'm Flash. I'm just like Flash, who's my older, counterpart, but I'm going to take over his role. As opposed to Robin, who I guess could be a legacy character in a way, but the fact that he doesn't grow up to be Batman puts him more in a different character. He's more the protege character, right? So the role, or the outsider character, like McGann would be the outsider character. She's from an alien planet, right? She doesn't know the rules. So the playbooks are really focused more on what is your role in the story kind of a thing, right?
Yep.
Unpack that a little bit too. Like the Janus actually fascinates me because that is not a way I would normally look at a character like Spider-Man, and it makes such perfect sense.
Yeah. Again, attached to sort of the Hawkeye thing was the realization that it didn't make sense to break these characters up to me to create the kind of stories I wanted by exactly what they can do. It made sense to break them up by the issues that they're facing and the complications attached to it, the role they fit in the overarching story, and the people who are surrounding them that are tied into their overarching story. Especially as I started realizing that there were these parallels to characters that aren't instantaneously obvious. So, for instance, even though, the Flash or Kid Flash has these speed powers and they're ridiculous and over the top, and at their utmost you can run through walls, that also then ties in, though, to later Robins who have this giant family of Bat people around them with Batgirl and Batman and Nightwing. And so even though their powers are totally different and you look at them and you're like, these characters are pretty different, they're actually hitting the same notes. It's just those notes are at a different level than their powers. So all of the playbooks, part of the hope is you can look at any given one of your favorite comic book characters and figure out, oh, if I make this character this thing, they mean something different than if I make them this other thing. And I can sort of tweak specifically which version of Robin I want to play by putting him into different playbooks. There's a version of Robin where you haven't actually proved yourself to Batman yet, and you're just starting out, and you've created your own costume, and you're going out and fighting at night and you're hoping that Batman pays attention to you, but
Right.
it hasn't happened yet. And that's the beacon versus the one who's already working with Batman, which is the protege, versus the one who is working with Batman and also has this long list of Robins behind him to live up to, which is the legacy, and so on and so forth. So, like, in a way, my hope is you can get Stephanie Brown, you can get Tim Drake, you can get Dick Grayson, you can get all of these different specific characters in their specific places using the different playbooks.
Right. So there's an interesting parallel someone made to me, which I hadn't caught, which I think is a good example here, which is the Stephanie Brown Batgirl. Is somebody said she's like the Spider-Man of the DC universe, and that she's trying to balance how much she enjoys being a superhero with living her everyday life. And they would both fit into the category of the Janus. And the Janus,
Yep.
Janus is reference to the two-faced Roman god who has two sides to their personality. And it's the same thing.
Yep.
Peter Parker and Stephanie Brown are trying to balance two parts of their life. And even though their power sets are not particularly similar, with the exception of swinging, maybe, wrapping people up, I guess, but their story that you tell at the table is very parallel.
Exactly. And that, the Janus in particular, came out from that realization. We often think of a lot of superhero characters as being defined by secret identity, because that's a classic trope. So many of them do technically have secret identities, but especially with more modern iterations of the superhero stories and the younger versions of the superhero stories, it actually is often really only an issue for some subset of them that they maintain a hard distinction between these two identities. I think about in Young Justice how, yeah, technically speaking, nobody knows Wally West is Kid Flash at large, but we see him at home, and he's with his parents, and with Barry, and Jay Garrick, and clearly everybody knows that they're all Flashes. Like, there's no hard line there. And it's telling us, even though technically speaking, Wally has a secret identity, this actually isn't his issue. This isn't his problem. It's not the thing he's actually dealing with. And the Janus is the playbook that let me say, cool. So for the rest of you, you can just sort of say, yeah, no, nobody knows that I'm Dick Grayson, but it's not the thing I'm dealing with. But then that person, it is the thing you're dealing with. It is a huge issue whether or not anybody finds out. It is a huge issue that you try to keep these lives separate. And it lets you hit that note of, this is what I want my story to be about.
Yeah, I love it. It's a fantastic way to have the mechanics approach the kind of stories you want to lead people to. I'm going to give a quick shout out here. There is a Masks long form actual play podcast called Nerds on a Roll. I just started listening to it. The characters are really kind of fun and interesting. And when they first created the characters, they were a little bit silly. It's like Kid Katie and the Golden Glove, which is basically a little kid who has inherited these boxing gloves that make him the current generation of this hero. And there's like a Golden Age Golden Glove and a Bronze Age Golden Glove, and like they're all his mentors, and he's the legacy. And then there's the Meteor, who's got these gravity control powers, but he's actually the Janus because he is trying to keep this hard line between his superhero form and his girlfriend's father, who's the district attorney or something. Like, it's all these tropes that you understand. And even though the characters or the players started off making some characters that kind of make you giggle and laugh, and it's a little tongue-in-cheek, the mechanics of the game pretty quickly make this a really intriguing storyline because of the way that you set up the mechanics, right? The outsider is a shape-changing dragon warrior Klingon kind of guy who's technically a teenager, but he's really old, and he doesn't understand human interactions, but he's got a crush on Kid Katie, and he doesn't understand what that means, and that becomes much more intriguing and interesting in how they work as a team, right?
Yep.
So just putting an emphasis on how mechanics can feed into the type of story that the game designer would like you to explore is very, very important, right? And I think you nailed Young Justice. And I think our listeners are going to figure out what we're talking about when they listen to the game here, because I think you and I agree. This is one of the best games we've been a part of in a long time.
This was awesome.
Yeah. So we're gonna go ahead and get onto that. So is there anything last minute mechanics or anything you want people to know before we dive into the game, and then we'll talk about we'll re-meet with people in the post?
There's lots of little bits and lots of little fiddly pieces to masks. The two things I just want to say for everybody is, first of all, if you are interested in any way in following along, we do have the basic moves and the playbooks available up for free download at our magpiegames.com website. So you can always go take a look, see what is triggered and what the actual moves are and what the rules are if you have any interest in watching that happen. And mechanically, the one thing I would call out as an additional piece is influence, which does come up within the game a few times. And it's this mechanic for tracking whose words matter to you, whose words can actually affect me and change how I see myself, because your labels don't just represent how you see yourself, they also change as your self-conception changes. And so there's this whole thing there where adults can say things to you, because all adults have influence over you by default, to change how you see yourself, and you have to choose, do you accept that and just shift your labels, or reject that and risk even worse consequences coming through. Your teammates might be able to do that to you as well, depending on whether they have influence over you. And it's an important part of the overall ecosystem of masks to make us pay attention to how your self-conception is changing based on the things people around you say.
Yeah. A good example I think of is McGann's first appearance in Happy Harbor, where she may say her freak may be very high and her mundane may be very low. And even though she's trying to fit in by using these Hello Megan references, you know, her mundane's -2, which is the lowest you can get, and her freak is +3. But at the end of the episode, Calder, says, that all the team gives her a pep talk. Like, they give her an encouragement. And though they could maybe remove a condition, what they may be doing is trying to help her switch her labels. And when you succeed in this particular move, you could reduce someone's freak and increase their mundane to help them feel more normal, right? And so they're so flexible, all of these labels and how they affect, and it changes the mechanics, because if all your powers are based on freak, and your freak is low because people are helping to make you more stable, you might have to walk that line between, like, okay, I'm not accepting my certain parts of myself, or I want to be more human than I want to be Kryptonian, or whatever it happens to be. So it leads to some great narrative twists. So I'm so glad you brought that up, because it does come up quite a bit in our game. So let's get on with that. In the game, Brendan gives us the heads up on what the current situation is. It is 2 years post season 1. It starts at McGann and Connor's graduation and goes downhill from there. It's pretty amazing. So, and back uphill again, I will say.
It's a good time.
It is a good time. All right, thanks so much, Brendan, and let's dive into this game.
Thank you.
Conclude Mask's actual play pre-discussion. First actual play episode in T-6 days.
You've been listening to Whelmed, the Young Justice Files podcast. Our hosts are Rich Howard and Emily Booza. Our editor and producer is Neil Powell. Our theme was composed by Emily Mio. Our logo was created by Kevin Bates. Whelmed is a fan-made podcast and is not officially affiliated with DC Comics, DC Entertainment, Warner Brothers Animation, and any other owners of Young Justice or its related source material. As such, these companies have sole ownership of all symbols, images, names, logos, and proprietary material related to Young Justice. Original content of this podcast is ours under Creative Commons. Thanks for listening, and stay whelmed.